Thank you very much. Thank you also for giving me the tough task of maintaining time. Um, as you are all aware, trade, and there's no need to demonstrate it any further, is quite a powerful engine for trade and for economic development and growth. If you just look at how the Asian countries have made till today, is essentially on the back of trade. So when we also look at Africa's trades, simple statistics show that back in 1993-94, total African trade was in the tune of 256 billion US dollars. As of December 2013, the total African trade was $1.4 trillion. So there's been quite significant improvement in the volume of trade. But unfortunately, looking in the details, we found out that trade is still largely dominated by commodities. And unless we get into more value addition, we are not going to create the necessary jobs. We are not going to create the necessary value addition for government to raise fiscal and other revenues. So what we are going to try and do in the next 50 minutes that we have here is to look at how trade can be improved through either improvement of the business climate or improvement in the value chain. From African Export-Import Bank perspective, what we've been trying to do in adding value was to introduce new programs and new products in order to address the shortcomings of African trade. I can give a few examples. One of them is in the airline, where we've been financing African airlines in order for them to link more African countries together. So you have a company like Kenya Airways, which benefited from a $2 billion facility. We did finance the Angolan airline, and we also finance the Fly 540 airline. Another product which is to add value is what we call the Africa Cocoa Initiative. The Africa Cocoa Initiative tends to give more value addition to the African cocoa locally in Africa. As you're aware, 4 African countries account for around 80% of the cocoa production output in the world, namely Ivory Coast, Ghana, Nigeria, and Cameroon. So we've introduced a program to assist those countries transform more of their cocoa locally. And the third program that I want just to put here before I pass on the floor to my colleagues here, is what we call the Contour, Construction Tourism Relay Facilities. You know, if we are to attract investors in our continent, we need to have the appropriate hotel facilities. The first thing an investor sees when he comes in a country is the hotel where he's staying. And if he's not staying in a hotel that is of international standard, he probably will not come back again. So we have a product which we call Contour, Construction Tourism Relay Facilities. With this product, we've been able to assist African promoters build hotels to international standards. And those hotels are then managed by international firms. So these are the 3 products that I wanted to bring to your knowledge. Before I pass on the floor to the audience, let me just ask Oliver, if you can come up with one or two recommendations, since you have been operating at a very practical level, one or two recommendations that you would like to put to either the World Bank or even African governments as to improve this trade and business environment climate, what would that be?
Well, thank you. I'm pretty sure I'm not qualified whatsoever to give the World Bank any advice or African governments, but let me perhaps just run you through a chain of thought of something that I actually think could help. Pablo Picasso once said, good artists copy, great artists steal. So my colleagues and I were actually very fond of stealing good ideas and applying them to areas where they haven't been applied. Let me take one step and then I'm going to be very concrete and come back to what you ask. So we steal actually a lot of thinking from good models that work, like I love right now what you can learn from Tesla and the original demise of the electric car, especially in this country, and now the revenge of the electric car. And when you look at what Tesla is achieving in changing the entire car industry and obviously the fossil fuel issue and whatsoever that's coming with it, it's absolutely fascinating for a company that actually only produces 30 or 40,000 cars and is a niche operator, but they still transform the entire mindset of an industry. So the reason why I'm mentioning that is obviously it's a little bit self-serving because that's what we think we're doing in supply chains in certain industries. But leaving that self-serving aspect, and apologize for that, aside for a second, when you look at Africa and all of the issues you and all the experts are discussing, obviously it's about transport and logistics. For me, very practical. When it costs me the same amount of money to ship a container for one of our portfolio companies from China to Africa, then it costs me to truck it, then another 300 miles to Addis Ababa. There's obviously an issue here, and you have to be hyper competitive to overcome that. But when you look at logistics, transport, when you then look at industrial zones and how you can optimize things like that, which obviously is a huge contribution, as far as I understand it, often in industrial zones, the backlash is you have now the infrastructure, you have the electricity, you have all of that kind of working, but now there's backlash because there's no local employment, things are perhaps not working because nobody knows how to maintain them. So what we're doing right now is we actually do it a little bit differently in our Asian activities. We look to invest in the factories, give them the growth equity to upgrade their existing facilities, and part of that can also be relocating some non-compliant factories that have all the issues on infrastructure and electricity and relocate them to industrial zones, but also take care of the worker training, work with the non-profits on the ground, work with all other partners, with the IFCs of this world to really do this. Now, and thirdly, that leads me to again, integrated solutions, to stick with Annabelle's theme, or big solutions for big problems. When you think it through, then, okay, integrating African manufacturers into the global value chain can be hugely instrumental. Just do it because it is a competitive advantage, and you can actually build a competitive advantage around being located. That's how we look at Ethiopia right now, because we think it can increase the competitive advantage in that industry if we do it. We don't do it because it's $30 right now instead of $68, because that's not going to be sustainable anyway. And the last aspect is really increase all of this and the integration into global value chains with technology. So we're spending a lot of time and money to work on a technology platform for our portfolio and for the buyers to integrate vendor management systems with, on the compliance side, on the ERP side, on the accounting, on the non-financial reporting side, basically into the factory's ERP systems and operation system, because then you can also suddenly secure all kinds of aspects through the chain, through technology.
Thank you. Annabelle, any comment on what you just said?
I think that, there are pros and cons to the different options, and I think that one has to look at them very carefully in the context of a specific country. I believe, special economic zones or export processing zones are a second best option, in the sense that it is preferable, of course, to get the whole of the business climate right, the whole of the infrastructure right, the whole country right. But sometimes this is a bit more difficult to do. So this spatial solutions are second best alternatives to begin to develop, in particular, a manufacturing sector in a country. I think they provide a number of advantages in terms of making it easier, to implement reform in a smaller space, providing the infrastructure in a smaller space. But having said that, it cannot be disconnected from the country as such. It cannot be disconnected because in many ways the business environment is one. I think it was clearly being said here that, for instance, if an investor arrives at a hotel that does not meet certain standards, it's very unlikely that the investor will. That's absolutely clear, and that is probably not part of the special economic zone. Now, having said that, there are also things that need to be taken care of. Strengthening linkages with the local economy is normally one that is quite clear. I mean, Oliver was saying that this is a problem in special economic zones, and in most cases it is. So my point is that there are, again, pros and cons. I think that for spearheading manufacturing in certain places, special economic zones may be an alternative. They need to be done in the right way. There are many good stories of success as regards special economic zones, but there are also many stories of failure. And one needs to look at this very carefully to make sure that you're going the right way. And I would like to say that I believe that one very important element of success when talking about special economic zones is a very clear link to the private sector, because the private sector will be able to identify these opportunities in a much more business-like way in many occasions. So to me, this linkage with the private sector is absolutely essential.
Now, let me open the floor for discussion to the audience. You can either raise issues, questions, or make comments, but please introduce yourself and the organization you work with. Yes, the lady here.
I'm heading the private sector department of the African Development Bank. My name is Mrs. Diallo. My questions related to burden sharing in terms of financing and how to de-risk trade finance transactions in Africa. Learning from the experience of Asia, when the multilateral development lending institution, the Exim banks, the Export Credit Agency, and the Trade Insurance Agency have been working together to address the trade financing of the Asia and the MENA region. That kind of collaboration has not been effective in Africa. In your view, and based on your personal experiences, I mean panel members, what are the concrete actions that could be considered Africa? Thank you.
Another question?
Good morning. My name is Connell Duffy. I'm with Alliant Insurance Services. We are brokers at ATI. And I think it's very interesting in respect of the government side and multilateral agencies providing solutions, but the private markets that provide insurance and support to various transactions in Africa are also a very big part of what you're trying to do here. And the more that you can do, and I'd like to hear what your ideas would be to promote that, I think the more that we're going to see in terms of trade and investment.
Can you speak louder?
In Africa.
Yeah. Okay. Can you speak a little louder, please?
Yeah, I was just suggesting that there are a lot of avenues for the multilateral agencies and bilateral agencies to promote trade and investment in Africa, but you're not really going to be able to achieve much unless you bring in the private market insurance agencies, which their volumes and their abilities to do things, their capacity in respect of the broader kinds of cover that they can provide, that's going to make the real difference, and that's been the difference in other parts of the world.
The third one, before we, yes.
My name is Guy Beng. I'm head of the Export Promotion Board of Côte d'Ivoire. My question goes to Madame Gonzalez. What case do we make for SME development in terms of trade and competitiveness? Second question, I'm happy that African Link opened an office in Abidjan. Congratulating. What about ATI? Since we start negotiating, what about your move in West Africa? Thank you.
Okay, we have three issues that were raised here. Maybe I will give you the opportunity first, since you have to leave.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you very much. I would like to refer to your question on the small and medium-sized enterprises to say that this is one of the areas in which we work very much in different countries. It is essential, of course, for a well-functioning business sector in a country to have a strong SME sector. It's very important, in particular, for job creation. Now, as we know, SMEs normally face the challenges associated with access to capital, access to technology, access to markets, access to information. So we have programs to work in each of these areas, as well as to connecting SMEs to international markets, where the challenge is even greater, be it through the development of supply chains, and we have some interesting examples again in some of these places, like in the meat sector in Chad, where we are working right now, but also by assisting them in exporting directly. We also work with export promotion organizations, and certainly would be ready to work with you in programs of this nature. So I want to take this opportunity to just excuse myself, because I need to leave. But I have two of my colleagues are here in the audience, David Bridgman and John Speaksman, and they'll be glad to respond to any other question that you may have. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, Annabelle, for your contribution. Josh, you want to answer the other question before I touch on the one from
maybe
Mrs.
I'll
Diallo?
attempt to answer maybe all, but not just to give my own view of the questions. For the first question, where Ms. Jallo asked, I think maybe the challenge we have in Africa is mainly because we have very few of the agencies we talked about, the ECAs and trade credit insurance and Exim banks. We only have for ECA, maybe we might have one or two in South Africa. We have ECA. Of course, maybe in North Africa, we have a few, maybe in Egypt and Tunisia, and of course ATI. And the trade credit space as well, compared to maybe in the MENA regions and and the East, where you have at least critical mass. So I'm sure they can come together to influence maybe some decisions. On the second question on the which was asked by ATI broker, I believe we in ATI we try to use the private market quite a lot as well. So again, it's a question of a few players in the market who can access the London market, for instance, and but something which I think is quite critical, and it's true that we need to use the private market more also to kind of create more capacity, because there's enough capacity out there. To Guy Bengi, of course, I'm sure you're quite familiar, and we're quite happy with the assistance you've been giving us to try to get Côte d'Ivoire to join. But the good news is that now, like I said earlier, the ECOWAS Commission has taken up the task of bringing in the new members, and I think we've made quite good progress in that direction. In fact, I believe in the next couple of months we should be coming to Côte d'Ivoire to discuss the specifics on how you should be joining. But I think after this, maybe we can have a one-to-one to discuss that. Thank you.
Now, let me also probably add something on what George said about the cooperation between Exim banks and ECAs and etc. One of the key issues we are facing in Africa regarding export credit is that most African countries that are exporting to counterparties that are stronger in terms of risk than the exporter. So it makes the paradigm of an export credit totally different. You see, for US to have an export credit agency is very important because they're exporting to weaker countries. But for an African to have an export credit, it does not always make sense because the party to which the African exporter is exporting is usually, in terms of risk, stronger. So you have countries that have tried, there are very few export credit agencies in our continent from Africa's perspective. I think that's one of the reasons. That being said, we do, from African exporting bank perspective, we do cooperate with a lot of export credit agencies on both sides. One side is to try and bring more capital goods in our continent in order to transform African export sector. As I said at the beginning of this session, although trade has increased in terms of volume, but it is still dominated by commodities. Take simple 4 countries that I mentioned. A country like Ivory Coast, which is my country of origin, when we got independence in 1960, total output of cocoa for Ivory Coast was 80,000 tons. It's currently 1.6 million tons, but less than 20% of it is transformed locally. So you need export credit agencies not to export that cocoa raw, but to have equipment that help you transform that cocoa into a value-added product. So we have an export credit facilitation, loan facilitation program at the bank, which is working quite well. We currently have in excess of $1 billion worth of line of credit, which we are using to help African economies acquire the equipment and so on. And we'll be more than happy to share more of that experience with the African Development Bank, who has already given us, the Afrexim Bank, a line of credit in order to meet those long-term requirements. On the private insurance, we've started working on them with the imminence of Basel III. We are now using more and more the private insurance market. We have currently a couple of agreements with some private insurance so that we can offload part of the risk that we have on our books in order to create more space on our capital adequacy ratio. We've started working with ATI also on it, but some private insurance on Lloyd's market. And I'm sure it's going to develop a little more over the next few years, given the imminence of Basel III and the impact it will have on the capital of banks in the continent. I take the compliment of Mr. Mbeng, and I thank you for that. I think we come to the end of our session. I promise that I will try and meet the time. So I hope you would join me in thanking our panelists. And I thank you very much for your kind attention.
Doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.